In the last video, we went over an introduction to scattering objects onto our terrain. In this video, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this and use some textures to drive the distribution of our point cloud. So let's go ahead and show you how we can do this. So the first thing we need to do is select our point cloud, and then we need to come over to our terrain context, and we want to import our height field. So, and actually to do this, I'm actually not going to do it in our scene context. Let's just instantiate our terrain into our lookdev context, and we'll lock that to our viewport. And then we also are just going to create a matte material. And this is what we're going to be using to visualize what we're doing. So let's assign that to our terrain real quick. And you can see with our height field just plugged into the color, we just get the output of what our height field is looking like. So obviously that's going to be black at the bottoms and white at the very top of our terrain, because it's being displaced the most at as the values go up towards pure white. So let's adjust this a little bit. So we want to create a gradient, so a texture gradient. And let's wire our height field into our input and our input into our color, and it turns straight white, and that's because we don't have a second point in here for our gradient. So let's add a black point, and now you see the tops of our terrain is black and the bottom is white, which is more in line with what we're looking for. So let's go ahead and set up kind of where we want the distribution to happen. So anything that is black, and we'll have to invert this at the end, but right now we're going to treat this as anywhere that is black is going to have no points being scattered onto it. So let's drag this down so the tops of our terrain don't have any trees being scattered onto them. And now we don't want the bottoms of our terrain to be affected by this at all. So let's drag this white point closer to where our black point is. So that's pretty decent. But we want to break up this line, so we don't have just a straight line all the way across with even distribution and even gradient, because that would look super CG and not very good, especially with a lot of points that you're scattering. So let's adjust this. So let's create a blend. So we're going to do a multi-blend, and we'll explain why here in just a second. But we also want to create a fractal. So let's adjust our fractal first. So let's drive that into our color. And now you can see that we have this fractal applied to our entire geometry. So we want to control the scale of this. So the way that we do that is through a constant color, and we can wire that into our UV scale. And then if I select this little ball of color right there, I can go into this value right here and drop this either down or up. So if I set it to something like 5, it's going to scale up the fractal. If I set it to something lower, like let's go 0.2, it's going to drop it quite a bit. So let's leave it right there for the moment, and let's start setting up our blend here. So if I drag this into our layer 1 color and our fractal into the layer 2 color, and I put this into our color, you're going to see that nothing is really happening right away. That's just because it's set to as blending mode of over. If I set this to something like multiply, it's going to only be affecting our terrain with where there is white from our gradient. So we want to control this a little bit more, because like I said before, we don't want the decimation to happen at all in the valleys. We just want it to be in this little area right here to break up that line. So let's use a inversion for our gradient. Drag that into our input, and then we also want to drag this into our color mix for layer 2. And that's just going to isolate this section right here where our first gradient was. So where this value lines up on our texture, we want that to be the same thing that we're affecting. So let's go back to our fractal noise here, and let's just adjust the contrast a bit. If I drag this up quite a bit, you can see that we have a bunch of contrast happening. It's kind of breaking up our texture a little bit. Obviously, we don't want that to be so harsh. So we'll drag it down to maybe like 50%. And maybe we'll play around with the blend mode. So get some different things here. Obviously, don't want to use screen. You got to be careful which ones you use. Let's do difference, doesn't work either. Let's do subtract. And then maybe we play around with our contrast again. And we just get a little bit of breakup going on in our texture here. So obviously it's breaking up a little bit of what our straight line was looking like. So let's look with and without it. There's a straight line and it was just an even gradient across it. So here is with it, or without it, I mean. And then here is with it. And let's maybe adjust this a little bit more. Bring this up some. And that's looking pretty good. It's broken up quite a bit here. So now if we go back to our scene, so we'll lock our scene context, and let's actually re-input our standard material onto our terrain. So we want to go into the point cloud, and we want to bring in all that we just did right there. So we can go back to our terrain, and we can bring in, what was the last node, the multi-blend. So now we can set this multi-blend as the decimate texture. And you can see that it doesn't do exactly what we're looking for. And like I said, that's because we need to actually invert it. So let's just create an texture invert, and we can keep it in this context. That's fine. And now it's working. You can see that we no longer have trees on the top of our terrain, and we can tweak this however we want. You could also use slope masks and things like that if you wanted to use those. But let's go ahead and crank up the number of points in our point cloud here. Let's set it to like 20,000. Whoops. Obviously, that would be 20,000 points scattered all the way across our entire scene. Since we're decimating it, there's not going to be 20,000 points total. And we can continue to adjust this. Let's set it to maybe 60,000. And now our forest is starting to fill out a little bit better. And let's go to our previs mode, set that to none, and let's actually hide our point cloud. And now you can see that we have a bunch of more trees in our scene, and it's all controlled dynamically in Clarisse. Let's crank that up maybe even a bit more. Let's go like 80,000 or 120,000. And now we got a pretty full scene going on. And you can see if I come over to this other mountain as well, it's being affected fully. And then if we want to change this, we can just come into any of these settings. Maybe we'll drag this up a little bit, or if we wanted to really bring up where our trees are showing up, you can see that they're starting to show up quite a bit more up towards the top of our terrain. And if I continue to drag this, it's going to affect it even more harshly. So it's a pretty procedural way to control where your trees are being placed or your objects are being placed on your scenes in general. Works very, very well. And like I said, you can use any sort of masks that you have exported from any of your terrain creation softwares or whatever else that you're using. Let's just change this light real quick too. Just add a little bit more light into our scene. Make it a little bit brighter. But it works pretty well. So that's how you use the texture decimation to drive where your objects are being placed inside of your scenes. And it works really well, allows you to have a ton of control in your scene, and you can obviously dynamically change it however you want, and you can change your masks at any point in time if you decide to go back into your terrain software and export something else, or change your terrain in general. You could just apply this straight to anything that you want. So hopefully this helped you out and got you a little bit more involved with your scatterers, and you figured out how to use them a little bit better. So I do have a bunch of other videos on my channel about Clarisse, as well as some on Houdini and Sema4D and Redshift as well. So if you're interested in any of that, definitely recommend you go and take a look at those. I also have some more Clarisse content coming, so keep an eye out for all of that. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any of that as well. So anyways, thank you guys for watching and have a good day.